1941, Bletchley Park, England. August rain drummed softly on the corrugated roofs of the wooden huts. Inside, a line of teletype machines clattered like distant artillery. Paper tape fed endlessly through their wheels, spitting out strings of 5-letter groups, random, meaningless, relentless. At a terminal near the wall, a young signals clerk rubbed her eyes. 2 intercepts from a listening station in Kent waited in her tray. German Army teleprinter messages, long and almost identical. Regulation said she should separate them, process each one in sequence. But fatigue blurred habit. She clipped the tapes together to save time, threading both into the reader as one. The machine stuttered, then printed a rhythm no one had seen before, patterns emerging within the chaos. She frowned, marked the margin, and handed the sheets down the line. In the next hut, a mathematician named Bill Tut would study those pages and realize something extraordinary. A doorway had opened into Hitler's highest communications. Neither the tired clerk nor the codebreakers yet understood that her small deviation, an accidental mistake of routine, had just cracked the first seam in the Reich's most sophisticated cipher machine. To grasp the magnitude of that moment, we must step back to the invisible front, where technology and intellect fought for the fate of Europe. By the summer of 1941, Europe was a continent divided by radio waves. Hitler's empire extended from the snows of Norway to the sands of Libya, but its strength pulsed through invisible signals, a nervous system of cables and high-frequency bursts stretching across every occupied capital. Messages between Berlin, the field marshals, and the front flowed constantly, all wrapped in ciphers so complex that interception was little more than an act of faith. For the Allies, this unseen war of code had begun long before the beaches and tanks. In low huts scattered across Britain, mathematicians, linguists, and wireless operators labored in secret, building the strange alliance between intellect and endurance that would become the beating heart of Bletchley Park, known officially as the Government Code and Cipher. School. It was a manor-turned laboratory, its lawns converted to antenna fields and its windows sealed against gossip. Out of this unlikely warren of rooms came the breakthroughs that shortened the war, and one night, the world's first accidental step into the age of computing. The name most outsiders knew was Enigma, the portable cipher machine used by German naval and army units. After years of effort, and crucially the pre-war work of Polish cryptanalysts, Bletchley's scientists had begun breaking Enigma's codes routinely. Each captured key setting yielded convoys spared, submarines hunted, and raids plotted days in advance. Yet at the highest levels of command, another device waited. The Lorenz S-4042, a monster of electrical complexity reserved for Hitler's direct communications with his generals. The Allies called it Tunny. Lorenz was Enigma's elder sibling by intellect and cruelty. Where Enigma had 3 or 4 rotors, Lorenz spun 12 wheels threaded with metallic pins, producing billions of possible combinations per message. It encrypted not manual Morse but teleprinter text, pure electrical impulses transmitted through landlines and radio beams. The Germans believed it impregnable, its design known to fewer than 50 men in all the Reich. To the Allied cryptographers, its existence was a whispered nightmare. Intercept stations could hear the signals, a chattering pulse riding Germany's radio spectrum, but no pattern could be seen within the noise. To confront this problem, Bletchley created an experimental cell in Hut 6, later moved to a separate wing known as the Testery, after its commander, Major Ralph Tester. This was a place unlike any other on the estate, walls mapped with endless cipher streams pinned by steel pushpins, clerks hunched over adding machines, paper reels stacked like ammunition. Their task was Sisyphean, to identify logical structure inside messages written by machines that no one outside Germany had ever seen. Among the recruits was a young Cambridge mathematician named William Thomas Tut, quiet, methodical, gifted at imagining order in chaos. Alongside him, rows of mostly young women, clerical coders, typists, Wrens from the Women's Royal Navy Service, worked in shifts, transcribing intercepted traffic from monitoring posts at Knockholt and Cheltenham. Each line represented another heartbeat of the enemy's hierarchy. Hours passed in the measured music of teletypes, the muffled clack-clack of punch machines, and the steady scratch of pencil calculations. Long before anyone grasped its significance, the critical intercept arrived. It passed through that chain of anonymous hands late in August 1941. 2 encoded Lorenz messages from the same German operator sent minutes apart. Exhausted, perhaps irritated by poor radio conditions, the German officer had retransmitted an entire message, but shortened words to save time, forgetting that such repetition was forbidden. When the British coder joined the twin sequences into one feed, she unwittingly produced the comparative key that Tut would use to rebuild the cipher's architecture from scratch. Mistake met mistake, and from that symmetry emerged opportunity. In those days, nothing about this work felt heroic. Secrecy meant that even their families believed they spent the war filing paper or working for the postal service. Nights bled into mornings under blackout curtains, the smell of hot circuitry in the air. Yet somewhere among those meaningless letters lay the pulse of strategy. Hitler's personal orders to Field Marshal Kesselring in Italy, to von Rundstedt in France, to Rommel defining desert supply routes. If Bletchley could open this stream, it would see the war through the enemy's eyes. But between possibility and victory stood a wall of mathematics thicker than any armor, a fortress built of probability and electricity. To reach its gates demanded not only discipline, but an accident that no one could have planned. The Lorenz cipher was the crown jewel of German communications, a machine built to guarantee secrecy between the Führer and his generals. To Allied cryptanalysts, it represented a new level of sophistication beyond anything confronted before. Enigma had been a puzzle of rotors. Lorenz was a labyrinth of logic. Its transmitters converted text into patterns of electrical pulses and multiplied them through 12 counterspinning wheels, each set with a random arrangement of pins. Every key change meant a new galaxy of combinations. Breaking it seemed less like mathematics and more like divination. Intercept. Operators at Britain's outpost in Knockholt called the stream of noise 12-tone music. They filled reels of teleprinter tape with thousands of letter groups that meant nothing. Each line of 5 letters, VGJLT, XQUFR, was inked proof of ignorance. The codebreakers' world was one of monotony punctuated by slivers of revelation. They did not yet possess a machine capable of handling such complexity. Their tools were pencils, graph paper, and intuition. The work fell to 2 divisions. The testery, made up of linguistic and statistical analysts under Major Ralph Tester, and the Newmanry, led by mathematician Max Newman, devoted to mechanical shortcutting of logic. Each lived on strong tea and sleeplessness. Their motto was unspoken: find structure inside madness. The breakthrough began not with genius but fatigue, on both sides of the radio war. One August afternoon, near Greifswald in Germany, a complacent cipher operator transmitted a long Lorenz message to the generals in Vienna. An error in line reception erased part of the text. Ordered to resend it, he took a shortcut, retyping the same message but with abbreviations and minor wording changes. What neither he nor his superiors realized was that he had reused the same starting settings for the machine. It was the one mistake Lorenz could not forgive. At the listening station in Kent, British radio technicians detected the duplication. The 2 transmissions arrived hours apart, almost identical. The clerical staff fed both rolls of intercept tape into the code sorting system. Standard protocol required separate logging and timestamps, but a tired arm splinted both together. The accidental concatenation, as researchers later called it, produced a composite line of ciphers. One message echoed against its sibling, offering a friction pattern like 2 gears meshing. When the combined tape reached Bletchley Park, it landed on the desk of 30-year-old Cambridge tutor Bill Tut. Tut had no formal training in cryptography, but possessed an almost uncanny feel for patterns. He compared the 2 columns of characters side by side and began penciling differences. Within days, he deduced that the cipher relied on additive sequences generated by independent wheels. With nothing but radio intercepts and logic, he reverse-engineered a machine he had never seen. The moment he explained the mechanism to colleagues, the room went silent. They realized that the Lorenz encryptor, the Germans' top-secret marvel, was no longer theoretical. Its logical skeleton existed on paper in front of them. Over the next months, Tut and his team reconstructed the full 12-wheel configuration and created a mathematical model capable of predicting its behavior. The process turned rooms into jungles of paper. Messages were graphed by hand across long sheets, coffee rings marking margins. Clerks slid rulers over strings of figures, counting cycles of repetition. The air smelled of graphite and damp wool. Somewhere beyond those brick walls, the Luftwaffe bombed London nightly, unaware that its commands fluttered into British ears via lines of algebra. By late 1942, the tunny decrypts, partially solved but not yet efficient, were beginning to reveal snippets of Hitler's operational traffic. Army Group Center to Führer HQ appeared on printouts like ghosts from forbidden territory. Each breakthrough fused exhilaration with dread. The codebreakers knew that if Germany learned their cipher had been penetrated, the system would change overnight and their months of arithmetic would turn worthless. To accelerate progress, Bletchley brought in engineer Tommy Flowers from the post office research station at Dollis Hill. He proposed building a machine composed not of gears but of vacuum tubes, circuitry, that could simulate logical choices thousands of times faster than human minds. His device, Colossus, would become the world's first programmable electronic computer. But before Flowers could justify the immense cost, he needed proof of Tunney's practicality. That proof had come from a single concatenated tape. 2 mistakes on opposite sides of Europe bound together by clerical exhaustion. The revelation reshaped the war's secret dimension overnight. From that moment, Allied intelligence could tap directly into the communications linking Hitler to his field commanders. For the first time, the Allies were inside the enemy's brain. The revolution would unfold slowly, through mathematics and machines, through sleepless analysts and singing wires. But it had begun. Now all that remained was to harness accident and calculation into a working weapon. The Lorenz SZ-40 was unlike anything in Allied possession. Its 12 cipher wheels, each studded with movable pins, advanced in irregular rhythms that produced a constant churn of unpredictability. If Enigma was a symphony of 3 notes, Lorenz was an orchestra tuned to chaos. Every pulse of current translated letters into patterns of 5 holes punched on a teleprinter strip, creating an electric code within a code. Bill Tut's breakthrough, born of those paired German messages, shattered the myth of invincibility. From only the ciphertext, he reconstructed the wheel patterns, proving that logic could substitute for espionage. It was an astonishing intellectual feat, achieved not through field agents or stolen devices, but through pure mathematics. Yet solving one message still consumed weeks of paper, charts, and human endurance. Max Newman understood the problem differently. A seasoned logician who had studied under Alan Turing, he saw the team's efforts as perfect fodder for mechanization. Why rely on rooms of calculators when a machine could perform the repetition itself? His answer came from the industrial engineer brought quietly into Hut 11, Tommy Flowers. He constructed Colossus, enormous cabinets of circuits and spinning tape reels driven by vacuum tubes. Its task was simple in principle but monumental in result. Compare cipher sequences at electronic speed. Where humans took days, Colossus took hours. Nothing like it had been built before. At full hum, Colossus glowed like a furnace. Rows of valves shimmering under blackout lights, its fans roaring against sleepless air. Yet its birth owed itself to the same accidents that started the project. Faulty typists and tired clerks had found patterns humans alone could never have planned. Technology, human error, and human intellect were merging into something entirely new. By 1944, 10 colossi operated in unmarked rooms inside Bletchley Park and nearby huts at Dollis Hill. Each new reel of tunny traffic fed into their spinning jaws, producing decrypted German text in less than a day. The codebreakers could now read Hitler's correspondence with Field Marshal Model, the Führer's assessment of the Eastern Front, and orders to withdraw divisions from Italy to reinforce France, all before those orders reached their targets. The invisible war was shifting balance through electricity and probability. Inside the testery and Newmanry, war was measured not in shells but in seconds between transmissions. The people who lived there were young, brilliant, and largely forgotten. Most were mathematicians too unfit for combat, or linguists with stammers unfit for command. Their names rarely left the payroll. Rows of women in uniform, the Wrens of the Women's Royal Navy Service, typed 19 hours a day in rooms that smelled of sweat and machine oil. Paper scraps piled knee-deep. At night they slept beside the warm hum of Colossus for lack of beds. Camaraderie took the form of jokes and codes. birthdays noted on cipher sheets, nerves mended by tea boiled on laboratory burners. These were the human multipliers behind the machine's success. Bill Tut worked apart, a quiet presence sketching arrays of numbers onto his pad, while pipe smoke clouded the lamps. Witnesses remembered him as polite, almost shy yet tireless in translating intuition into equations. Max Newman drifted through the room in loose gait, encouraging precision with the calm of a schoolmaster. Tommy Flowers, perpetually tired, checked valves until his fingertips blackened from solder. The human toll was real. Mental collapse became common. Some workers left the huts unable to touch a typewriter again. No one outside that small circle knew what they were doing. Letters home mentioned only clerical work. In their isolation lay both protection and weight, the knowledge that a missend, a misplaced plug could cost fleets and lives. When news of Allied victories reached the radio, their elation was muted. The secrecy oath forbade even a smile in public if it hinted at inside awareness. They celebrated quietly, an extra biscuit shared, a single night of music on the wireless before returning to the monotony of five-letter groups. Yet despite exhaustion and invisibility, purpose kept them steady. Every deciphered message saved convoys at sea, guided bombers through clouds, spared troops from ambush. And whenever fatigue dimmed morale, someone would unpin the tape of the original August 1941 depth and tack it beside the latest decrypt, a reminder that one mistake had begun their entire enterprise. Within those huts, intellect replaced gunpowder and chance replaced destiny. The combination would soon break not only a cipher, but the final illusion of Nazi command control across Europe. History often speaks of genius as deliberate inspiration. In cryptography, it can hinge on fatigue. The Lorenz cipher did not fall through espionage or theft, but by two operators, one German, one British, making opposite mistakes that complemented each other perfectly across hundreds of miles. On 30 August 1941, the German field station at Athens sent a long strategic message to Vienna. When an error forced retransmission, the operator reused the same key settings despite every rule forbidding it. He also shortened expressions to save minutes, his superior probably shouting to hurry. Across the channel, the British radio clerks received both versions. Protocol required separate filing, but a young woman at Bletchley's outstation, weary from double shifts, clipped the twin tapes together out of convenience. That single lapse defied two empires of discipline. For the Germans, it exposed a cipher regarded as sacred. For the British, it revealed correlation, a friction pattern between texts showing the cipher's inner skeleton. From two simple human missteps emerged a discovery that would end up changing both cryptography and computing. Every code breaker who saw those aligned symbols understood the paradox. The strongest machine secrets were undone by tired fingers and the smallest departures from procedure. War, it turned out, depended not on perfection but on entropy. Later computer scientists would call such moments information leaks. In 1941, they looked like providence. The team drew no pride from luck. They met it with duty. Next time, Max Newman said quietly, we must be ready if the world blunders again. The words became their philosophy. Treat every anomaly as opportunity. That mindset carried Bletchley from pencils to Colossus, from pattern recognition to electronics, step by hesitant step born of error. Tommy Flowers was not a soldier, but an engineer with an awkward gift for prediction. His fascination with switching circuits at the post office research station had no obvious wartime purpose until Newman recruited him. When he proposed replacing mechanical relays with vacuum tubes, colleagues laughed. Valves were unreliable, expensive, and prone to burnout. Flowers answered that telephones everywhere already relied on thousands of them. If they can connect London every day, they can break Tunney. He built Colossus largely in secret, cannibalizing laboratory resources and paying for parts from his own pocket when government funds lagged. The machine took form in the winter gloom of 1943. Tall frames loaded with 2,500 glowing valves, looping reels of punched tape, electric currents humming like quiet thunder. Engineers recorded no glamour, only exhaustion. Carrying heavy panels through snow to avoid Luftwaffe eyes, wiring by hand until knuckles bled. When Colossus Mikiweon ran at last in January 1944, it reached speeds the staff could barely comprehend, reading 5,000 characters per second, comparing probability patterns in flight. 10 seconds of output equaled days of human calculation. The devices multiplied across the estate until 10 stood humming, hidden behind camouflage netting. Leadership at Bletchley worked by humility rather than rank. Newman's mathematicians deferred to Flower's engineers. The Wrens trusted the logicians. The hierarchy of invention flattened under necessity. Knowledge traveled faster than paperwork. That culture, born by accident and secrecy, seeded the post-war science of computing itself. Each success carried moral weight. Analysts saw in Colossus something frighteningly modern, an intelligence greater than any single human but dependent on them all. The machines processed Hitler's encrypted thoughts with mechanical indifference, translating death orders as easily as weather reports. People operating them began to sense the war's next frontier, reasoning by machines. By 1944, tiny decrypts had reached the desks of General Eisenhower and Churchill before most German staff officers read them in Berlin. Bletchley's insights mapped troop movements, fuel shortages, and Hitler's stubborn insistence on holding impossible ground. The Allies adjusted strategies weeks ahead of reality. When the Normandy invasion approached, decrypted Tunney orders confirmed that German commanders expected feints at Calais. That validation gave confidence to proceed with D-Day itself. Yet with knowledge came secrecy. The success of the Lorenz break was so valuable that it outranked alliance. Only a few Americans were informed. Even within British intelligence, fewer than 200 people knew of its existence. The moral dissonance lingered, using information that could save lives without ever acknowledging its source. Operators who intercepted messages about forthcoming German reprisals or death march orders could document them, but never alert civilians. The chain of secrecy was absolute. After the war, those same individuals carried silence for decades. Bound by the Official Secrets Act, they watched newspaper stories about Enigma glorify other units, knowing their achievement eclipsed it. The double mistake that had given them access to Hitler's private communications remained classified until the 1970s. What they left behind was a paradox. The decisive intelligence victory came not from flawless discipline nor righteous transparency, but from fallible humans guided by moral restraint. The testeries workers never saw the front line, yet they wielded information that bent the war's timeline. They learned there is power more dangerous than weapons, knowing too much too soon. Their unseen labor stood on the threshold between human intuition and machine logic, between the world that existed and the one that was arriving. The next chapters of their story would unfold amid reels of spinning tape as electricity, chance, and mathematics extinguished the sound of Hitler's final commands. January 1944, Bletchley Park. The snow outside the huts was waist-deep, muffling the constant drone of generators. Inside Hut 11, Colossus mech, I stood awake for the first time. A steel Colossus in name and frame, 6 feet tall, valves glowing like embers inside its chest. Wrens in headset muffs hurried between reels of teleprinter tape that rattled across the room. The hum of electricity joined the steam hiss of kettles forever boiling on the radiators. For the people inside, this soundscape was both lullaby and frontline barrage. The purpose of that night's run was simple: feed Tunney traffic from the Eastern Front into England's newest invention, and see whether the machine could isolate the wheel patterns automatically. For months, mathematicians had done it by hand, calculating probability of bit sequences with pencil and patience. Now, logic itself was mechanical. At 02:13 hours, operator Dorothy Dubois flicked the power relay. The tape ran, the valves pulsed, and columns of figures printed onto continuous sheets. In the next room, Max Newman and Bill Tut waited for the small bell that signaled a successful pattern. For long minutes, the only sound was the rumble of paper. Then faintly the bell chimed. On the printout gleamed 2 numbers in sequence, the calculated chi and psi wheel correlations, both correct. The room burst into restrained applause. What had taken 6 weeks of human calculation was solved in under half an hour. The machine had learned to think faster than its makers. By dawn, Hut 11's windows steamed over with condensation. Engineers leaned against the cabinet sipping black tea while ink dried on the first fully mechanical solution to the Lorenz cipher. Newman wrote one note for the record: operational success, probability validation consistent. Outside, The world slept through history. In the months that followed, Bletchley Park became a quiet volcano of information. Every intercepted tunny message, and there were hundreds per day, passed through Colossus and re-emerged as German plaintext printed in block capitals. Sections once lost to guesswork now flowed directly into summaries for SIS and Chef. The British nicknamed the incoming intelligence ultra-tunny to distinguish it from Enigma's decrypts, which already filled Churchill's briefcase each morning. By spring 1944, Hitler's last cipher was an open book. Analysts read his insistence that no divisions be moved from Calais, even as Allied deception operations strengthened that illusion. They saw his anger at Rommel's defensive plans, his refusal to allow retreat on the Eastern Front, and the nervous chatter of staff within the Wehrmacht High Command as supplies faltered. To those reading these lines under the no-smoking lamps in Buckinghamshire, the Führer's empire already looked hollow. Among them sat the same coder who, years earlier, had fastened 2 stray teleprinter tapes together. Her name had been lost in files labeled simply clerical staff. She watched the machine blur meanings faster than her eyes could keep up, unaware of how her one act had created the field that now turned on light and vacuum instead of fingers and luck. Even in triumph, the secrecy remained suffocating. The staff were forbidden to tell fellow workers in other huts what Colossus did. Flowers engineers were not allowed to see decrypted translations. Translators never saw the glowing valves. Compartmentalization was armor against betrayal. Curiosity was treason by accident, but victory drew near with every printout. In May 1944, Colossus Mechatosecond was completed, twice the speed of its predecessor, processing 25,000 characters per second. Its first assignment carried a code name only a few people recognized: Fortitude South. Through its reels, message fragments from Field Marshal von Rundstedt to Berlin revealed German belief that the Allied invasion would strike Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. The validation of that misdirection gave commanders confidence to commit every available resource to Operation Overlord. D-Day followed 6 weeks later. While soldiers stormed the beaches, Bletchley Park read the panic bleeding out of Hitler's headquarters in daily Lorenz traffic. Decrypts confirmed confusion within the Wehrmacht. Orders issued, counter-orders cancelled, desperate pleas for direction ignored. "The Führer sleeps," one dispatch complained. In those hours of fighting across sand and surf, the silent alliance between chance and computation proved its final power. Colossus never cheered, never wept. It blinked through its circuitry, converting despair into voltage. Yet every pulse it processed shortened the war, saving thousands who would never know the machine's name or the woman who had started its trajectory with an absent-minded clip at a typewriter. The Lorenz's defeat marked more than a tactical victory. It showed that the human brain could teach a mechanism to mimic insight itself. But even with Hitler's private orders flowing daily into Allied hands, one question remained. What else in humanity or hubris would this new kind of intelligence be used for when the guns fell silent? Spring 1945. The final cascade of tunny messages covered Hitler's collapse in real time. Each day the machines in Hut 11 fed new reels through their spinning jaws, deciphering dispatches from the shrinking world of Nazi command. Analysts sat in silence as typewriters rendered German despair into English. Reports of empty fuel depots, railways destroyed, cities deserted. The war that had once seemed infinite now sounded like static fading from the airwaves. By April, Colossus was working around the clock. Its operators scarcely looked up from the paper feed. At 2 a.m. came the deciphered transcript of an intercepted message. Orders for scorched earth unfulfilled. Construction battalions disobey. 2 lines later, another. The Führer remains in Berlin. The analysts stared at the words like archaeologists deciphering a dying language. For years they had watched this cipher voice-shape catastrophe. Now it stammered incoherently. Only a handful of senior staff were authorized to read complete decrypts. Most workers knew fragments, snippets of tone, bits of translation, the emotional pulse beneath technical form. One message praised heroic fortitude to the last. Another lamented troops' refusal to fight. None referenced surrender. "He's talking to ghosts," one translator murmured. It was April 25th, the same day the Red Army encircled Berlin. Through those final transmissions, codebreakers effectively witnessed Hitler's end before the world would. On April 30th, a tunny message from Flensburg reported, "Command now transferred." The next day, a longer instruction followed, an obituary disguised as routine directive. By the time radio broadcasts confirmed Hitler's death, Bletchley knew it had already happened. The young clerk who once pinned the two identical tapes stood in the decoding room when news arrived formally. Around her, staff exhaled without celebration. Their victory was wrapped in secrecy. Nothing they had done could be spoken aloud beyond those walls. They tore the used reference tapes from the machines and burned them in metal bins behind the huts, the smoke curling into the same gray sky that had hung over Britain since the war began. In the chaos of the European armistice, Colossus continued its work for one last purpose: monitoring communications from Japan and Soviet units moving into Central Europe. Even the engineers who built it sensed that the device had outlived its war. "We have made a thing that thinks faster than thought," a technician wrote in his notebook, "and now we have to destroy it." Within weeks, military command ordered Colossus decommissioned and classified. Most units were dismantled and smashed with hammers, wiring torn, frames melted. Only 2 were secretly retained for post-war intelligence, hidden under new designations. The blueprints were burned. The men and women who operated them signed lifetime secrecy oaths. The accidental clerk returned to civilian postal work, her name swallowed like the ash drifting over Buckinghamshire. For Bill Tut and Max Newman, the triumph carried strange melancholy. They had unlocked the last great Nazi cipher, only to watch their creations disappear into state censorship. For Tommy Flowers, who had financed part of Colossus with his own salary, the silence felt heavier. When he applied decades later for reimbursement, the government told him records of his contribution did not exist. His response was dry. "I suppose that proves how secure we made it." Meanwhile, the knowledge harvested from Tunney's collapse reshaped Allied strategy in its closing months. Intelligence from Bletchley allowed commanders to direct relief to starving POW camps and identify which Wehrmacht units would surrender intact. It even influenced early planning for the occupation zones of post-war Germany. Few decisions after April 1945 lacked some trace of information drawn from those invisible pages. By May 8th, VE Day, the lights in Hut 11 burned low. Operators detached the keyboards, filed the last reels, and stacked unused paper into crates for disposal. When the announcement of victory echoed over public loudspeakers, the workers were told to remain calm and indoors. They shared muted toast with rationed sherry, then returned to sort scrap metal from classified fragments. Only the faint whir of the cooling fans reminded them they had helped end a war. Outside Bletchley's gates, the world erupted in relief. Fireworks over London, bells ringing in shattered continental towns. But inside, the staff packed the remnants of history into silence. The machine that had read Hitler's mind was now its own secret prisoner, locked within government vaults for another 30 years. As for that accidental mistake 3 summers before, the moment when 2 mistakes became revelation, no memorial ever marked it. Yet without it, there would have been no Colossus, no accelerated victory, and perhaps no blueprint for the computers that would reshape the next century. The last Tunney message to cross Bletchley's intercept network arrived on May 10, nothing more than a weather report from a surviving German field unit. Its code, once insoluble, unraveled instantly inside the machine. The operators read it, smiled faintly, and shut the power off for good. The noise stopped. The age of electromechanical warfare was over. In the vacuum left by its silence, humanity stood staring at its creation, a mind born of error, a weapon born of patience. What remained was the question of what such intelligence would do when no one was listening for an enemy anymore. When the doors of Bletchley Park finally opened in August 1945, the noise that leaked out was only the echo of papers being stacked, cabinets locked, and people exhaling after 5 relentless years. The staff trickled back into ordinary life, carrying skills no resume could mention, and secrets no letter could reveal. Londoners who had lived through the Blitz never guessed that 30 miles away, a handful of tired mathematicians and engineers had rewritten the nature of intelligence itself. Officially, the Lorenz project never existed. Reports were retyped to remove the name, the term Colossus deleted, photographs hauled into furnaces. Even within Britain's own armed services, knowledge of Tunney decrypts remained compartmentalized. Unit histories credited aerial reconnaissance or luck, for successes born of intercepted thoughts. Among those silenced were Tutti, Newman, Flowers, and the anonymous clerks whose mistakes had begun it all. The victory their work had ensured transformed the final months of the war. Hitler's communications, stripped of secrecy, provided the skeleton key for Allied command in Europe. Every redeployment, every desperate fuel plea, every collapse relayed to Berlin had been read in London first. Ultra sources report continued chaos. One surviving memo declared, a sentence that summarized both the enemy's fate and the quiet triumph inside. HUD 11, yet the people responsible returned to anonymity. Bill Tut left for Canada to teach algebra. Max Newman returned to academia. Tommy Flowers resumed postal engineering, forbidden to publish his technical designs. The young women of the Royal Navy's Women's Service went back to clerical work, marriage, or study, some never speaking of what they'd touched. Decades later, interviews captured a common refrain. We thought we'd wasted the war. Secrecy came at a cost beyond ambition. The destruction of Colossus and its plans effectively erased a decade of potential computing progress. When electronic computers re-emerged publicly in the late 1940s, from Cambridge's EDSAC to America's ENIAC, they were heralded as unprecedented. Only those bound by oath knew they were walking a path already mapped by Bletchley's engineers 4 years earlier. Flowers would later remark without anger, "We built the future too early." Political winds reinforced silence. The onset of the Cold War demanded new ciphers, new machines, and above all, new secrecy. Elements of the Lorenz project seeded British and American intelligence programs whose names changed as governments did. The people behind them faded into classified footnotes. To those watching from the outside, the myth of the Enigma story eclipsed all else. Enigma was romantic, tangible, broken by swaggering heroes. Lorenz was invisible. Too abstract, too quiet, too dependent on serendipity to make good theater. Only with declassification in the 1970s did fragments of the truth begin to surface. When restrictions lifted, several surviving codebreakers met at a small reunion near Bletchley. They stood before HUD 11, now empty and overgrown, and listened to the wind through cracked windows. Tut, modest as ever, shrugged at the fuss. Flowers, who had guarded his secret for 3 long decades, finally allowed engineers to photograph the rebuilt Colossus replica based on his sketch memory. "I didn't think anyone would bother," he said simply, watching the valves ignite again after half a lifetime of silence. The world that followed their secrecy belonged to the technology seeded by their success. Governments built machines capable of mapping continents. Corporations adapted vacuum tube logic to calculate finance, science, and eventually flight. Each pulse of electricity running through a modern circuit carried genetic memory of those wartime hours when information first moved closer to consciousness. The men and women of the testry convinced themselves they were fighting only a war of necessity. In truth, they had changed what battle meant. Their mistakes had created not just a path to victory, but the architecture of a new civilization, a world where thought could be measured, encoded, and rebuilt. And as 1945 gave way to peace, the question no one dared ask lingered under the surface of triumph. Now that mankind had taught machines to think for war, could it ever unlearn that lesson when peace arrived? The Cold War dawned almost seamlessly over the smoke of Hitler's defeat. The war of wires that Bletchley Park had mastered slid into the next generation of secrecy. Lorenz was gone, but the discipline it inspired persisted, a perfect alliance between mathematics and politics. Intelligence work no longer smelled of damp basements and solder, it smelled of ozone and inked blueprints. By 1947, Britain's Government Communications Headquarters, GCHQ, had absorbed what remained of Bletchley's personnel and patents. The surviving colossi, stripped of their serial plates, moved quietly to new compounds. They were relabeled as transcription units and set to work intercepting Soviet traffic. For decades, their existence remained a rumor denied with bureaucratic grace. The accidental clerical worker who had once misspliced the intercept tapes never again saw her wartime companions. She married, had children, and carried the silence as a private burden. Only when the official secrets began to uncoil in the 1970s did she realize the global machinery her fatigue had set in motion. By then, she was in her 60s, reading newspaper stories about computers that could think, and recognizing in their circuitry a dim reflection of the device she had once fed with paper tape. Across the Atlantic, America's engineers built upon hidden humility. Claude Shannon formalized information theory, mathematics that explained what Bill Tut had done intuitively. Alan Turing, whose earlier work on Enigma underpinned Bletchley's method, expanded his ideas into the foundations of artificial intelligence. Together they took the accidental spark from Lorenz's fall and used it to light a field that reached far beyond espionage. Within the post-war years, Tut and his colleagues quietly resumed academic research, creating the abstract models that would evolve into networked computing and algorithmic design. They taught students who would one day design both commercial mainframes and digital missiles. Each generation unknowingly continued the trajectory that had begun with those two flawed German messages. Recognition, when it finally came, felt less like celebration than archaeology. In 2009, the British government formally declassified the Lorenz story, crediting Tut, Newman, Flowers, and the anonymous staff of the testery. The first reconstructed Colossus was unveiled on the site of Bletchley's wartime huts, rebuilt from memory, its valves glowing as they had in 1944. Visitors watched lines of paper tape glide through the reader, unaware that the gentle rhythm was once the heartbeat of Hitler's undoing. Bill Tut died before the exhibition opened. Flowers had already been gone for years. On the museum wall behind their photographs hangs a short statement typed in courier font. Human error revealed machine logic. Machine logic revealed human frailty. For the veterans of Bletchley, the reunion was bittersweet. They recognized in modern computers the same mechanical pulse they once guarded with secrecy and fatigue. But the relationship had changed. The post-war world had inverted their creation. The tool built to save civilization now quietly governed it, calculating mortgages, flight paths, chain reactions, and, ominously, strategic deterrence. Historians later framed Lorenz's story as the moment information overcame geography. Distance no longer protected nations. Command signals could be cracked and answered before orders reached the front. The world would spend the next century navigating that paradox, more connected, more informed, less secure. For Britain, Bletchley's legacy turned from embarrassment to pride. In 2011, a bronze statue of Bill Tut was placed in his hometown of Newmarket. GCHQ named a building after Tommy Flowers. The nameless clerk's record was never recovered, only deduced. Her signature line in the transmission ledger simply reads, "Processed and filed." But within those words rests the accident that bridged the gap between coded ink and digital light. Time softened the story into legend. Two messages, two mistakes, two kinds of brilliance meeting across the strangest battlefield in history. From that improbable convergence came both victory and invention. The last German cipher broken, the first electronic intelligence born. And while the wooden huts of Bletchley now stand preserved behind glass, their silent discovery still powers the world beyond them. A reminder that sometimes humanity's grandest leaps begin with a simple, tired error on an ordinary night. Wars are remembered for thunder, but sometimes history pivots on the sound of paper slipping through a machine. One tired clerk joining two cipher reels became the hinge on which modern intelligence turned. Her mistake was small, human, ordinary, and yet from that imperfection emerged a vision of logic that changed how the world would think. The fall of Hitler's final cipher was not simply triumph in a war of nations. It marked the beginning of a different conflict, one fought inside circuits and probabilities. What began as an act of wartime necessity grew into the blueprint for computation itself. Bill Tut's formulas, Tommy Flowers' circuits, and Max Newman's quiet insistence that calculation could be mechanized turned the mathematics of survival into the grammar of the digital age. Those who labored in those huts never sought monument or fame. Their brilliance lay in discipline and in humility before randomness. They proved that accidents are not always failures. Sometimes they are discoveries wearing the mask of error. The randomness of one night's fatigue reached across decades, pulsing through satellites, networks, and every electronic thought that followed. Today, the word Colossus means more than a machine. It signifies the moment humanity glimpsed its future through the haze of war. Every screen, every encrypted signal, every digital heartbeat carries a trace of Bletchley's rhythm, the hum of valves, the whisper of diligence, and the lesson that destiny can be hidden inside oversight. In the silence after victory, the last operators switched off their consoles and stepped into dawn light, believing their work would be forgotten. Yet the world kept running on the logic they left behind, and so the legacy of Bletchley Park endures, a testament to the power of intellect guided by chance, and to the simple fact that even in humanity's darkest engineered chaos, understanding still finds a pattern. Sometimes by design, sometimes by accident, always by courage. If you like the documentary, hit like, share your thoughts below, and subscribe for more real WW2 stories every day. Thanks for watching.